Psalm 23. We confess one and the same individual as perfect God and perfect man. He is God, the Word, which was flesh. For if he was not flesh, why was Mary chosen? And if he is not God, whom does Gabriel call Lord? If he was not flesh, who was laid in a manger? And if he is not God, whom did the angels, whom came down from heaven, glorify? If he was not flesh, who was wrapped in swaddling clothes? And if he is not God, in whose honor did the star appear? If he was not flesh, whom did Simeon hold in his arms? And if he is not God, to whom did Simeon say, Lord, now lettest thou thy servant depart in peace? If he was not flesh, whom did Joseph take when he fled into Egypt? And if he is not God, who fulfilled the prophecy, out of Egypt have I called my son? If he was not flesh, whom did John baptize? And if he is not God, to whom did the Father say, This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased? If he was not flesh, who hungered in the desert? And if he is not God, unto whom did the angels come and minister? If he was not flesh, who was invited to the marriage of Cana of Galilee? And if he is not God, who turned the water into wine? If he was not flesh, who took the loaves in the desert? And if he is not God, who fed the 5,000 men and their women and children with 5 loaves and 2 fish? If he was not flesh, who slept in his ship? And if he is not God, who rebuked the waves in the sea? If he was not flesh, with whom did Simon the Pharisee sit at meat? And if he is not God, who forgave the sins of the harlot? If he was not flesh, who wore a man's garment? And if he is not God, who healed the woman with an issue of blood when she touched his garment? If he was not flesh, who spat on the ground and made clay? And if he is not God, who gave sight to the eyes of the blind man with the clay? If he was not flesh, who wept at Lazarus' grave? And if he is not God, who commanded him to come forth out of the grave 4 days after his death? If he was not flesh, whom did the Jews arrest in the garden? And if he is not God, who cast them to the ground with the words, I am he? If he was not flesh, who was judged before Pilate? And if he is not God, who frightened Pilate's wife in a dream? If he was not flesh, whose garments were stripped from him and parted by the soldiers? And if he is not God, why was the sun darkened upon his crucifixion? If he was not flesh, who was crucified on the cross? And if he is not God, who shook the foundations of the earth? If he was not flesh, whose hands and feet were nailed to the cross? And if he is not God, how did it happen that the veil of the temple was rent in twain, the rocks were rent, and the graves were opened? If he was not flesh, who hung on the cross between the 2 thieves? And if he is not God, how could he say to the thief, Today thou shalt be with me in paradise? If he was not flesh, who cried out and gave up the ghost? And if he is not God, whose cry caused many bodies of the saints which slept to arise? If he was not flesh, whom did the women see laid in the grave? And if he is not God, about whom did the angel say to them, He has risen, he is not here? And if he was not flesh, whom did Thomas touch when he put his hands into the prints of the nails? And if he is not God, who entered through the doors that were shut? If he was not flesh, who ate at the sea of Tiberias? And if he is not God, on whose orders were the nets filled with fishes? If he was not flesh, whom did the apostles see carried up into heaven? And if he is not God, who ascended to the joyful cries of the angels, and to whom did the Father proclaim, Sit at my right hand? If he is not God and man, then, indeed, our salvation is false, and false are the pronouncements of the prophets.